Hello and welcome to episode 296 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, miraculously here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz, and what am I, like 14, 15 hours ahead of you now?
You are 15 hours ahead of me, yes.
Wow.
Congratulations.
That might be a record.
You've made it to the future.
Yes, I'll tell you all about it, and you can invest in some stocks and bet on some sports. I'm pretty sure that's how it works.
Excellent. Do you have the almanac?
Not yet. Maybe I'll go shopping for that tomorrow.
See if you can find it, yeah. How are your Asian travels, Jason?
Good. I flew Delta A321neo out to Seattle and had what felt like the longest connection ever to a 330neo onward to Taipei first, and then onward again earlier today on a JAL 787-8 over to Haneda, line number 21 for the 787.
Wow.
So it was an elderly model.
So line number 21 would be basically the second good 787.
Yeah, not a terrible teen, but I can't
close.
Imagine this was Boeing's best or finest produced 787. I don't think they had quite figured it out at that point, but hey, it was nice. It got us here, and the wing didn't look like somebody had slapped 400 patches on it. It looked pretty good.
The paint was still attached, and it wasn't just a speed tape wing.
Or it has been reattached probably several times at this point.
That's
it was
possible.
A nice ride.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad things are going well. I'm back in Chicago, 15 hours behind you. I was in Norfolk, Virginia last week, where I attempted to fly on GE Aerospace's 747. That didn't work. Thanks, weather. So as it turns out, when you're trying to fly in conditions that are conducive to contrail generation so you can study them, and the weather doesn't cooperate, you don't get to fly, because by the time I got there, there were no contrails. None. Not a single airplane making contrails.
You had some pretty epically bad luck, because we did not have weather on the East Coast of any nature for like 2 months until the day you arrived, and then it rained.
And then it rained, and then it was too wet, and then it was too warm in one spot, too cold in another. It was all sorts of annoying, but had some really great time with the GE Aerospace 747, had some really great time with the GE Aerospace, both the flight crew and the engineers who are working on both the Codex research program with NASA, but also the RISE, the upcoming engine platform, which is, it's interesting. They stress it's not an engine. The RISE is not an engine. It's an engine platform, because they're developing all of these components that you can use in different ways. So we're going to talk about that. We're putting together all of the video that I shot and the interviews that we did. And so those are going to be available in the coming weeks on our YouTube channel. And we'll probably cut some of the audio so that it can be available here as well, because the conversation I had with the pilots is absolutely just fascinating. One of the pilots, former military fighter jet pilot, came over to GE Aerospace and is now their lead pilot. And some of the stories he has about flying, a 747 with the GE 9X engine attached to the wing is rather something. And then the pilot currently sitting in the right seat is a former RAF fighter pilot, and also has the distinction of having launched 2 rockets from a 747 as a former Virgin Orbit pilot. So very cool.
What can't the 747 do?
I mean, that was basically our conversation. And, is there anything the 747 can't do? And the answer was pretty much no. So I'm very happy about that. And hopefully I'll get to fly it one day in the future. So we're back next week. Jason is off next week. I'll be in Sweden. So I'll be bringing you the podcast next week from Sweden with some good conversation from the fine folks at Flight Radar 24. We're going to talk about whatever's happened over the past week, but also some more Flight Radar 24 centric stuff while Jason enjoys, whatever Jason's enjoying.
I'll be on a work trip to Dulles, as we know. That it's no fun.
You are the luckiest man out there. The luckiest.
This is the fun part now in Asia.
Right.
The dullest part is the sad travel.
Well, in an effort not to keep Jason up too much past his bedtime in Tokyo, let's get to the news. This week, we begin with the Swiftair 737 crash in Vilnius. This was a 737-400 aircraft operated by Swiftair on behalf of DHL. It was approaching Vilnius airport when, according to the ADS-B data that we have received from the aircraft and CCTV video that captured the final moments of the flight, the aircraft was on approach about 1.5 kilometers from the runway when it dived suddenly and rolled significantly to the right. So we don't know much more at this point other than that. What we do know is that investigators are currently working to understand what happened. They have recovered both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. Unfortunately, one of the pilots on board was killed. However, the other pilot and two other crew members only sustained injuries, and they are currently in hospital. Hopefully, they will be able to make a recovery. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board is currently leading a team of U.S. investigators, including personnel from the NTSB, Boeing, and the FAA to Lithuania to assist in the investigation. As per ICAO Annex 13, the NTSB has, however, said, of course, that, and this is a mouthful as the title goes, the Ministry of Justice of the Republic of Lithuania Transport Accident and Incident Investigation Division will lead the investigation.
Couldn't even get that complete sentence out.
In English, no matter in Lithuanian. So we will hopefully know more soon. In an interesting development, we don't know if this is related, but it's interesting that they were so quick with this. The Polish Air Navigation Services Agency sent one of their King Airs to Vilnius to perform an ILS calibration at Vilnius. Now, this was previously scheduled to happen, but they changed the nature of the testing that they were doing as part of the beginnings of the investigation into this crash. So that, an interesting factor, something to keep in mind. Now that they have the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, hopefully we can learn more in a preliminary report in a few weeks' time. But based on the video evidence and the ADS-B, just very sudden roll to the right and descent into terrain. So
yeah,
hopefully
it doesn't seem like the kind of thing that an ILS being out of alignment or anything like that, it would really have any practical impact on. But hey, if they're already doing that inspection anyway, why not bump it up a little bit?
Yeah, you might as well check it. We go back a few days in time and over to Turkey, where a Azimuth Airlines SuperJet suffered what we now believe to be a hard landing. The aircraft, upon landing, caught fire, though now the airline is saying, no, the aircraft didn't burn. It was fuel that spilled because we slammed into the runway. This is the airline saying it. This is not investigators, but the airline coming out and saying there was wind shear, which is altogether possible because the winds were not favorable that day. They were strong. They were gusty. So wind shear is absolutely not out of the realm of possibility. But the airline is saying that wind shear caused a hard landing and damage to one of the fuel tanks, which led to a fuel spill on the runway, which led to the fire that was visible. They're saying that the aircraft itself did not burn. So that's good, I guess. This was also a standard bring all the bags evacuation.
Ah, the Russian norm with an SSJ.
There's such great video of this one guy. He looks like a luggage porter. I mean, he's got bags on bags on bags. Just really, really great work all around.
Just a stereotypical Russian event. An SSJ has a hard landing, bursts into flames, or something bursts into flames, and people just grab all of their bags like nothing's wrong. Stop me if you've heard this before.
Yeah, a couple times, maybe once or twice. Just leave the bags, people. All that stuff can be replaced.
Yeah, maybe don't fly an SSJ if you could avoid it. They seem to burst into flames a lot during hard landings.
They are flamey bursty.
Yeah.
They are a bit flamey bursty.
It happens.
Yeah. So I don't even know if there's more to add. Turkish investigators are on it. Russian investigators have joined the investigation. So I'm sure we'll know something in the future of what actually happened to the aircraft. I have not yet seen pictures of the aircraft in daylight following the incident, but I'm sure they'll turn up at some point. Congratulations to Emirates Airline, which took delivery of its first A350 this week. And as the airline noted, its first new aircraft type since 2008.
Yes, that would be the A380 back then, I would imagine. It has been a long time, as they said, since they inducted any new aircraft, which is funny being Emirates, such a large airline. But I really, personally, I feel like Emirates put that line in the press release as a dig to Boeing, which should have delivered a new type to it, the 777X, quite a number of years ago, but still has not.
Yeah. I don't think that you're wrong.
Yeah, they would never admit that, but it's a weird thing to say otherwise without that kind of double meaning. But hey, the A350 for Emirates is long in the making. They kept pushing that off and off and off and back, but it's finally delivered. And I think it's entering service in Edinburgh at first.
Edinburgh is the first route. Yep.
Interesting.
In short order, they're putting it into the Emirates technical facilities where they'll have the final cabin fittings and all of that good stuff. And then it will enter service to Edinburgh. So that'll be a fun flight to be on for some folks. Not many inaugural, new aircraft going to Edinburgh. So good for them.
Yeah, good for them. That's nice.
A final report is now out from the UK AAIB regarding the incident regarding a Ryanair 737 MAX 8-200, which happened last December. So this was the 4th of December last year. We discussed this a few months ago at this point, I think, when a preliminary report came out. But now there's a final report and we get some more numbers. Last time we talked about generally, I think, what happened, but now we get to talk about how it happened. So this was an approach to Luton, and there was an unstable ILS approach, a manually flown go-around, during which they missed approach altitude and climbed too high. The pilot flying noticed that, nosed down the aircraft, then had to make a recovery during which the enhanced ground protection warning system sounded. This entire event occurred in instrument meteorological conditions, so they did not see what was going on outside. They commenced the go-around at 1,940 feet above mean sea level, about 3.6 nautical miles from touchdown. When they were setting up their approach, the mode control panel altitude was set to 100 feet. It was not reset to the missed approach altitude. So there was no capture of the missed approach altitude during the go-around. The missed approach altitude was 3,000 feet. The aircraft made it all the way up to 4,030 feet. The pilot noticed this and nosed down the aircraft, descending at a maximum attitude of 17.7 degrees, reaching 295 knots indicated airspeed at flaps 5 before they initiated a recovery, at which point the aircraft was 1,740 feet above ground level. And that's when the ground protection warning system kicked in and started yelling at them.
Yeah, probably right to be yelling. What a mess.
Yeah. So the AIB notes that there have been multiple incidents with similar factors and setups. So the report is rather detailed, as a final report always is. We'll put a link to that in the show notes, but note that the AIB just says, just pay attention, please, to your settings and make sure you're operating on a stabilized approach, which all seems like very good advice.
Yeah, advice, I guess, is good to give. Not that this shouldn't be top of mind anyway, but I mean, they got lots of stuff going on up there.
Let's go over to Southwest Airlines, which this isn't a Southwest issue, but it just so happens that it's affected Southwest Airlines the most. To Southwest Airlines, and we talked about this as well, but now the NTSB and the FAA are involved. So this concerns the load reduction device on the 737 MAX LEAP 1B engines. So the load reduction device is a piece of equipment that it activates in the cases of severe engine damage. And so in this two particular cases, they were large bird strikes. So in one case, it was a between 10 and 14 pound bald eagle. In another case, it was a turkey vulture. This was brought to our attention by the incident in Havana, I believe, where we started looking at it. Both jets landed safely, but the problem here is that the load reduction device leads to smoke from the engine being sent into the flight deck or the cabin, depending on which engine is damaged. And so the left engine sends bleed air into the flight deck. The right engine sends bleed air into the cabin. The LRD is designed to, when damaged, to prevent the aircraft's fan, when it's significantly imbalanced, it prevents the aircraft's fan from continuing to rotate with the core of the engine. So it decouples the fan. It allows the engine to be lighter and has been available on multiple engines, according to CFM, which we talked about earlier. But the LRD activation allowed oil from the engine to contact hot engine parts, creating oil smoke that the air systems basically pumped directly into the aircraft.
Never good. Never good. Which is part of the procedure that when that is activated, an oil sump cover opens or something like that, I think I read. And it's not unintentional that this happens. It's just a side effect of the whole procedure of the LRD activating.
So it's closing, but after the smoke has already been pumped into the cabin.
Yeah. What I read today is that the problem is that this isn't a common occurrence. So it's not the procedure to avoid the cockpit or the cabin being filled up with smoke is not a memory checklist item. This is something that the pilots have to refer to checklists to figure out what they have to do to prevent that air from coming in the cabin. And because the 737 is a freaking dinosaur compared to everything else out there today, even though it wasn't supposed to be that way at this point, and it's why the MAX 7 and the MAX 10 still aren't certified, the airplane doesn't tell the pilots that, hey, this thing was activated, you should probably turn off recirculation or whatever it is they have to do with those checklists. And the pilots just kind of have to figure it out. They've got to figure out that, oh, something happened and there's unusual engine indications and vibrations and other things going on. So let's do this other thing. Whereas most other aircraft, or all other aircraft, would tell them using computers and screens, hey, this thing happened, react to it. Where the 737 can only say, something's happening. You go figure it out.
Something's happening.
Something's happening. Here's a bell and a light. Use your brain to figure it out. Really points to how the 737 is just a dinosaur in a computer age. And it's just everything about it just feels wrong.
So all of that said, to say that the NTSB and the FAA are looking into it. But according to Dominic Gates at the Seattle Times, the FAA has said that this is not an immediate safety issue, and so they won't be issuing any emergency directives for change. However, they are looking at what requirements are necessary moving forward, whether that's procedure requirements, a redesign of the part. We just don't know at this point. But we'll come back to this, especially if the NTSB gets involved or if the FAA decides to actually authorize changes here. This is a story that we've been talking about since the beginning of the podcast. And unfortunately, it sounds like it's a story that we're going to be continuing to talk about well into 2030. Multiple airlines this week saying we still have problems with engines on multiple aircraft, and it doesn't seem to be getting much better. This week, we'll start with ANA because Jason's in Tokyo. And They're grounding multiple A321neos, 787-8s, and 9s because of maintenance backlogs for the Trent 1000s used on the 787s and the Pratt & Whitney GTF engines used on the 321neo. 11 A321neos out of service and a handful of 787s. Let's see, we've got 4 787-8s, 6 787-9s out of service at the moment. Again, we can't confirm if all of those are engine related, but the airline is trying to get as many of those back in the air as they possibly can. Meanwhile, and stop me if you've heard this one before, Air New Zealand is also keeping its aircraft on the ground. They say possibly until 2026. So this includes 6 A320neo family aircraft spread across the A321neo and the A320neo and 787-9s through the latter half of 2024, and then a similar number of aircraft out of service across most of 2025.
I feel like I have nothing to add. We've talked about this forever. We're going to be talking about it forever. Next topic. There's nothing else here to say.
Well, tell me if you've heard this one before. Spirit Airlines has announced that it is possibly in danger of no longer being a going concern. Mandatory reporting makes them say these types of things. They have substantial doubt that they have an ability to remain a going concern during the next year due to the losses that they have incurred. However, in their third quarter financial filing, Spirit says that they continue to operate while the restructuring continues and that they, quote, look forward to emerging as a stronger company. Don't we all?
Okay, that's kind of the whole point of bankruptcy. So, cool.
Yeah, they're working on it, so we'll see what happens. Etihad announced 10 new destinations all in one go. So not the 44 destinations that Allegiant announced 2 weeks ago.
The bar is so high now. Why even bother with 10, 44? I mean, is the new floor.
Don't even announce any new race. Yeah. So let's see. We've got all of these begin actually pretty late in 2025. The first route actually begins in July. But, get ready to book your tickets now to all from Etihad's base in Abu Dhabi. We've got Algiers, Tunis, Atlanta. That's the one that begins in July. Hong Kong, Chiang Mai, Hanoi, Krabi, Phnom Penh, Taipei, and Medan. So a mix of 787s, A321LRs, and Atlanta will receive the A350-1000.
Surprising couple of destinations there that Etihad did not serve previously, actually.
Yeah. When they announced Hong Kong, I just assumed that they flew to Hong Kong already, but...
Yeah, interesting.
No.
Huh.
And Algiers and Tunis seem like those are easy pickings, but I guess, up until now, it hasn't been in the cards. But some good Southeast Asian destinations in here. So there you go. Let's go back to Emirates because we didn't talk about the most important part. We got so wrapped up in Edinburgh that we forgot to talk about the other UK angle to the Emirates A350 delivery. And that's the fact that it flew through UK airspace between Toulouse and Dubai. So it made a London gravity assist to Dubai. And a bunch of people were confused, rightfully so. And that all has to do with paperwork, which is odd because none of it's actually paper. So there are requirements going back to, I don't know exactly where they go back to, but they go back a long time. And the aircraft to complete the acquisition process to ensure that the aircraft is fully purchased and insured, you end up with the aircraft flying through UK airspace where they complete the paperwork while, it's basically a digital signature while the aircraft is in UK airspace, and then they turn for home.
Gotta stop doing this nonsense. It's gotta stop. In the same press release, they talk about delivering this aircraft on SAF fuel. They forgot to mention that it's all going all the way to the UK for nonsensical bullshit reasons. You're going to have to go back and bleep that out because I'm really tired but this has got to stop. You can't do this in the same thing where you're talking about you're flying the aircraft on sustainable aviation fuels, but you needed a whole hell of a lot more to do this nonsense. This has got to stop. And we've talked about this before, but this has got to stop.
It would seem that there would be an easy, maybe not easy, but a
easier
fix to this. You know, and if this is one of those things where like the law obliges us, why, if the UK government wanted to get together and say, hey, you don't have to do this. We've seen the airplane. We trust you. Sign the paperwork. That seems like something that could happen.
Probably should happen.
So if you're a UK, and I know that there are a few of you that listen to this podcast, if you are a UK based or if you've worked with the UK aviation legal strictures, tell me how we can change this or why this has to be this way. Someone please explain this to me. Email us at podcast@fr24.com because I know why it's happening, but I don't actually know why it has to continue to happen. And I would love for someone to explain that to me. So please reach out, podcast@fr24.com, and let us know how we can change this. If we can be the catalyst for change, we would love to do so. Because as Jason points out, announcing that you're taking delivery of the most fuel-efficient wide-body aircraft out there, using SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, and then flying thousands of miles out of your way just so someone can click sign on the DocuSign, that's ridiculous.
Has to be a better way.
Let's end with some good news. So we've got a few things that are interesting and just fun to follow. The Royal New Zealand Air Force has operated its first. I was surprised that this was the first one, but it is the first C-130 flight by the Royal New Zealand Air Force all the way down to Antarctica. They flew down to McMurdo, and I just assumed that they had been flying down there before. But no, this was in fact their first C-130 flight. So very cool to see them operating down there. They're going to do 6 total trips during the summer season, bringing passengers and cargo to McMurdo's Scott base. They did in fact land on one of the lovely ice runways down there. So very cool. And now I should note that this is with the new C-130J aircraft. So retiring the old C-130Hs. So good for them. And we'll put a link to some of the pictures in the show notes because I will never not look at pictures of landing on an ice runway. Heart Aerospace, which we sent our colleague Gabriel to, the Sweden facility where they are developing the aircraft, is coming a little closer to home for Jason and slightly closer to home for me. They have chosen Plattsburgh, New York as the location for the HX-1's first flight. Currently under development at Saba Airport near Gothenburg in Sweden, the electric HX-1 will arrive in Plattsburgh in early 2025, where it will conduct its first flight. They were possibly considering a remote controlled flight, but they have confirmed as part of this announcement that there will be a pilot on board. So very cool, bringing the aircraft closer to the home of Beta, where they are also in development and they've been flying quite a bit. So very cool. This will be what Hart is saying is the largest all-electric aircraft ever flown with a wingspan of 105 feet. The larger ES-30, which is the official passenger version that they're building towards, is scheduled to enter service late in this decade, right around 2029 they're targeting, and that one will be an electric hybrid aircraft. But the first demonstrator is going to be all electric. We're getting there.
Yeah, I'm not even going to ask why Plattsburgh, because that's like as far from New York City as possible in New York State, but that's cool. The only reason I think I'd ever go to Plattsburgh.
I was going to say you don't have to ask because their press release will tell you. They are choosing Plattsburgh because it's an emerging hub for next-generation transportation.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, if they say so.
They say so. Okay, so we talked about Coulson Aviation, the firefighting company, getting Part 125 certification so that they could carry passengers in their 737 Fireliners. And a bunch of people wrote in because apparently we have a lot of aviation enthusiasts / bushfire firefighters in Australia listening to the podcast. So thank you so much for listening. But they wrote in basically saying, hey, it's so we can get to the fires faster. One of the main drivers was their contract with New South Wales in Australia. So these fires are very far from the staging facilities, and getting to them quickly is a problem. And the 737 often travels empty to the near fire zone before beginning their water drops or retardant drops. So now they'll be able to carry about 100 firefighters to these rather small, more rural teams so that they can reinforce them or take over for them so that those firefighters fighting the initial fire can get some rest. So it does make sense and kind of along the lines of what we surmised, but great to see this happening and the ability to bring in fresh reinforcements.
All right. That just makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. As it turns out, some things just make sense.
All right. Well, I feel like we've gotten both ends of the spectrum, stuff that make absolutely no sense and stuff that just make a ton of sense.
That's what we aim for with this podcast. And with that, I'm going to let Jason go to sleep.
Thank you.
Jason, I will miss you next week, but we'll have the podcast directly from Flight Radar 24 headquarters in Stockholm, Sweden. And then we'll be back the following week with a new episode before we enter the vacation season. So hopefully we'll be able to get a few more episodes in. This has been episode 296 of AvTalk, closing in on 300. Here, as always, with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening. Good night.